Good evening, everybody. I'm Ian Lincoln, President of the Institute of International Affairs in New South Wales, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our evening with the interns. We're conducting this event at our headquarters at Glover Cottages in Sydney and broadcasting it nationally and internationally through Zoom. Each of our interns has chosen an international subject of particular interest to them and will speak on that subject for around 7 minutes. At the conclusion of all the presentations, we'll have the opportunity for questions. Please log your questions throughout the presentations using the Q&A function. If your question's selected, we'll call on you to ask your question with your audio and video on. You may direct your question at any or all of the speakers. So, without further ado, let's get underway. Our first speaker tonight is Namaya Malaka Haiwa. Namaya is majoring in international relations and media at the University of New South Wales. Her research interests include international development aid, Sri Lankan and Australian foreign policy, transitional justice, and maritime security. She's the executive editor of Politic, the UNSW International Affairs Review, and an editor for the Young Diplomat Society. She interned in Sri Lanka at the Institute of Strategic Studies in 2017. Her topic tonight is the revived quadrilateral security dialogue, the Quad, and its role in Australia-India strategic relations. Emilia.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My presentation this evening is focused on Australia-India relations and the impact on the quadrilateral security dialogue. If we had time, I would ask you what the vast majority of articles, if not every single one, has in common when talking about foreign policy of Australia and India. But tonight, I will save you the time. Simply, it is 2 words: historically divergent. The understated and often pessimistic perception of Australia-India relations is resultant of a historically dismissive relationship. Fueled by key differences in strategic alignment during the Cold War, India's status as a nuclear state, strenuous socio-cultural engagement, and a lack of economic exchange, all of which fell into a holding pattern of indifference over many years. At present, Australia's engagement with India is multifaceted, including strategic, economic, and socio-cultural avenues of cooperation. The bilateral defense partnership has grown throughout 2020, with the signing of 2 critical defense agreements established as part of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. The agreements are intended to bolster military cross-servicing capabilities and the outcomes of bilateral defense exercises such as AUSINDEX. The CSP is committed to expanding trade and investment flows, building trust through shared interests, democracy, and rule of law, and has also facilitated ongoing 2+2 meetings for defense and foreign ministers. Alongside this careful cultivation of a bilateral partnership, Australia and India's involvement in other regional security organizations remains crucial to achieving collective goals, and presented as one of the most important of these at present is the quadrilateral security dialogue. The Quad, consisting of Japan, Australia, India, and the US, gained its second breath of life in 2017, when 10 years of bilateral and trilateral relationship building created an atmosphere perfect for the revival of the dialogue. With the sweeping paradigmatic changes that have occurred on the international stage over the past decade, this second iteration of the Quad seems to be far less interested in censoring themselves, emphasizing a free and open Indo-Pacific and a rules-based order in the region, being almost explicitly implicit in its attempt to counter China's widespread influence. The messaging was just as clear in Australia's invitation to the 2020 Indian Ocean Malabar exercises, which just passed. It was the first time since 2007 that all states of the Quad took part, and evidences the intentions of the Quad to formalize further. Of course, the ministerial level meeting, which took place on October 6th, in person, considering the context of COVID-19, as well as the recent escalations in the India-China border dispute, seems to highlight that the revival of the Quad is meant very seriously and bodes significant shifts in India's own foreign policy outlook. Australia's invitation to the Malabar exercises comes at a fascinating time in the relations between the Quad nations and China, where India is experiencing escalating border disputes. Australia is facing enormous trade and economic repercussions in response to its call for an international investigation into the origins of COVID-19. Japan continues to be in a tense military standoff over disputed islands in the East China Sea. And the United States has been wildly anti-China within the past 4 years, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo insisting on multiple occasions that China must learn its place in the world. Regardless, India's intentions seem to be clear. Australia's inclusion is meant to highlight the ongoing effect of the Quad countries to support a free and open Indo-Pacific. Whether this will extend to a permanent invitation to the Malabar exercises will remain to be seen. India has signaled to China and the rest of the world that Australia's involvement in Malabar is a step forward for the Quad, confirmed by the promise of future standalone ministerial meetings. Given the criticisms of the East Asia Summit and the effect of polarizing Sino-US relations on its collaborative agenda, the Quad has the potential to fill the void of an active security bloc in collaboration with ASEAN. By no means, of course, does India and Australia's relationship become miraculously repaired as a result of this invitation. However, it is a step in the right direction for both improved bilateral relations and for the collective strength of the Quad. Should the Australia-India partnership remain the weakest of the various alliances within the Quad, there will always be a limit to what can be achieved. But the Australian-Indian partnership remains distinct to that of the economic relationship, where Australia is still very heavily reliant on the US, not only for security, but at times seemingly for guidance on foreign policy. Australia is also the developed economy the most reliant on China for trade, tourism, and higher education. Clear fault lines in Australia's torn approach to China, where the Quad presents a containment policy on China's influence, but economically, Australia's vulnerability limits movement strategically because of harsh consequences for domestic industry. India expressed concern regarding Australia's strategic clarity regarding China prior to the Quad's re-emergence in 2017, and these concerns have been thoroughly exposed in part due to COVID-19. However, with COVID-19 an unexpected forward driver of the Australia-India relations, as Australia attempts to diversify not only its export markets into India, but also lessen the dependence of Australian universities on Chinese international students, the two states have an excellent opportunity to develop people-to-people connections and trade relations. However, India's apprehensions and absence from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and Australia's pursuit of full ratification by 2020 may cause some friction. The RCEP was signed by 15 countries, including China and those of ASEAN, despite concerns voiced by India. India's absence from the world's largest free trade agreement could have significant impact on its anticipated role as a regional power. And because while defense ties with the Quad are expanding, absence from regional economic fora will leave India isolated in the longer term, economically and strategically. In the interests of not only the Quad, but also Australia's need for greater access to Indian markets, should Australia have tried to address India's concerns with the RCEP before it was signed? Perhaps. However, India's protectionism over its agricultural sector and Make in India policy against international competition is unlikely to be compromised, regardless of pressure for trade liberalization, as evidenced by the stalled bilateral free trade agreement. In what is somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy, the Quad and Australia-India relations are critically interdependent. The Quad provides an excellent platform for Australia and India to strengthen strategic cooperation with a stabilizing or mediating influence by Japan on the US. In turn, without robust relations between the two key regional powers of the Indian Ocean, any collective agenda put forward by the Quad will likely fail because there is little foundation for an effective cooperation. Australia-India relations are vital for the functionality of the Quad moving forward if it intends to become a permanent feature in the regional security architecture. Because should the US falter in its economic and military commitments, Australia and India must be prepared to step in together to fill in the substantive gap that will be left in the Indian Ocean without the power and the guidance of the US. Thank you.
Thank you, Namaya. Our second address is by Evangeline Larson, a dual arts degree graduate from the University of Political Science in Paris and the University of Sydney, where she majored in French, international relations, and Middle Eastern and North African studies. Following an exchange in Beirut, Evangeline is particularly interested in Lebanese politics and enforced migration. She recently qualified as a nationally accredited mediator and currently works in dispute resolution. Tonight, she has chosen to speak about the Western Sahara conflict, which has continued out of mind and out of hand for over 40 years. Evangeline.
Good evening. We live in an era in which intergroup conflicts are becoming more common than interstate conflicts, and yet many go underreported in the West. This year, more than ever before, many of these intractable conflicts have been sidelined in international affairs discussions, despite the UN call for a global ceasefire being predominantly ignored. Whilst the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has become synonymous with territorial and colonial disputes in the Middle East and North Africa, another conflict has languished, almost forgotten. Indeed, the Western Saharan conflict has bubbled away for over 40 years with little to no resolution in sight. However, this stagnation may be coming to an end, as the first clashes in the region since 1991 occurred just last month. In the next few minutes, I'd like to share with you a brief background to the conflict and the recent clashes, as well as explore why some protracted conflicts receive more attention than others. So let's start at the beginning. Spain ceded its former colony of Western Sahara to Morocco in Mauritania in 1975. Morocco annexed the area the following year, and what later Mauritania relinquished its claim. In response, the Saharan Arab Democratic Republic was formed with the aim of self-determination. Tens of thousands of Sahrawi people fled to neighbouring Algeria and set up camps following this annexation. Today, it is estimated that there are between 90 and 165,000 refugees currently residing in the Tindouf camps. From 1975 until 1991, Morocco and the Polisario Front, the pro-independence group representing many Sahrawi people, were at war. During this time, a giant 2,700-kilometre-long sand wall, known as the Berm, was built by Moroccan forces to separate the territories. In 1991, a ceasefire was called, and the UN mission for the referendum of Western Sahara, MINURSO, was established to determine voters and manage the transitional period. However, the referendum never actually happened because of the inability for all parties to agree on who should vote. Of key contention is who is indigenous to the area, given that many Moroccan citizens settled in the region after the annexation. Morocco's interest in what it calls its southern provinces is multifaceted. The area is rich in phosphate, iron ore reserves, and potential oil deposits. Recently, Rabat has also emphasized the need to de-escalate the spread of violent Islamic extremism in the region, which it directly associates with the Polisario. On the other hand, the pro-independent Polisario controls only around a quarter of the territory, known as the Free Zone. Fast forward to October 2020. It's been almost 3 decades since the fragile ceasefire was agreed upon. Many mediation attempts have failed, and negotiations that restarted in 2019 have stalled. In the buffer zone controlled by the UN peacekeepers, the small village of Gogarat is situated on an important road that carries trade to bordering Mauritania. It is here that tensions flared in mid-October, when a number of Sahrawi demonstrators blocked the road with a caravan of vehicles in protest of what they perceived as exploitation of their people's resources. In particular, the Polisario argue that this road's construction violated international law. Rabat saw this as a provocation and launched a military operation to restore traffic flow. The Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic's president, Ghali, deemed this a breach of the ceasefire and declared war on Morocco on November 14th. Skirmishes along the border have since continued, and Amnesty International has reported increased targeting of Sahrawi activists by Moroccan authorities. It's unclear what will happen next. So why now? Why has this conflict been so quiet on the world stage for so long? And why has it suddenly reignited? A large part of the answer to that question seems to be intrinsically linked to the quietness itself. Until recently, the Sahrawi people and the Polisario as their representatives have been touted as, quote, the ideal refugee. Ideal in the sense, if a refugee can be ideal, that they conform to Western values, particularly in the Tindouf camps, such as promoting secularism and women's equality. This identity has been constructed, mainly by the Polisario, as a survival mechanism to ensure monetary and political support from international actors. However, this seems to have been a double-edged sword. The idealized portrayal and need to ingratiate themselves to the West have arguably led to a lack of attention from the UN and other actors for the Sahrawi cause, as there are relatively few deaths and human rights abuses go underreported. There is significant research to show that media coverage centers negative and violent stories, suggesting that the normalized plight of a so-called ideal refugee is far less likely to sell. Morocco has also been fairly quiet, with strong diplomatic relations to Spain, the United States, and France, and its significant development investment in the disputed territory. Morocco has a reputation as being one of the few reliable Arab allies. As a result of these connections' support, Morocco has been able to maintain the status quo, in part by preventing human rights monitoring in the MINURSO mandate. Dr. Pablo de Orellana, a lecturer at King's College London, has explained that by promoting the narrative that Polisario is an illegitimate separatist movement controlled by Algeria, Morocco has slowly begun to change the minds of previous Polisario supporters and delegitimize their movement. Of the 84 countries that once recognized the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, 44 have since withdrawn their support. The recent clashes seem to indicate the Polisario may be moving away from their ideal refugee strategy. Capitalizing on the blockade and leaving the 1991 agreement is a clear cry for attention and support. At this point, Morocco's claim to the territory has stronger international backing than ever before. And the Polisario's only real option is to return to previous referendum discussions and prompt the UN to take action. How the Western Saharan conflict will continue to play out is obviously unpredictable. Indeed, it seems that in a world where white, privileged suffering garners the most attention, there's little room for the struggles of others. Conflicts persist for many reasons. However, it's important to consider how the international community's perceptions, preconceptions, and values play a role as well as internal factors. I hope this presentation prompts you to keep abreast of the Western Saharan conflict and consider what other intractable conflicts may be overlooked and why. Thank you.
Thank you, Evangeline. Our next speaker is Marcus Mcculloch, who recorded his address last week. Marcus is undertaking honours in political economy at the University of Sydney, writing a thesis on industrialisation in the Soviet Union. He completed a Bachelor of Arts Languages degree in 2019, majoring in political economy and Spanish and Latin American studies. He spent a year on exchange in Madrid studying world history as seen from the Iberian perspective. He's a keen debater. Marcus's address explores the challenges US President-elect Biden faces in repairing the damage to US alliances and the international system done by the Trump presidency.
Foreign policy was the last thing on the agenda in this year's US presidential election. But for those of us watching along from home, it should be the first thing on our minds. The foreign policy project that lies before Joe Biden, the president-elect, has been labelled the Great Undoing. In the last 4 years, Trump has alienated America's rivals and undermined the international system by cozying up with brutal dictators, backing out of global commitments, and failing to control the COVID epidemic. Biden's plan for a post-Trump foreign policy is to return to multilateralism, take a tough stance against Russia and China, and end America's forever wars in the Middle East. Some have accused Biden of living in the past. At 78, he will be the oldest president to ever take office. He draws his foreign policy experience from his years as vice president to the Obama administration, and Biden sees his foreign policy as a return to the liberal internationalism of the post-war period. In this presentation, I will explore the challenges and opportunities that Biden faces in trying to bring about this policy program over the next 4 years. The first thing that I want to talk about is Biden's return to multilateralism. This will involve two things. Firstly, re-signing agreements such as the Paris Agreement and the Iran deal, and secondly, recommitting to institutions such as NATO, the UN, the WTO, and the WHO. During the presidential campaign, the Biden team also came up with a third idea, which was a summit of democracies. And the idea of this summit would be to promote cooperation between democracies and to prevent backsliding into autocracy. However, this approach has been criticised for encouraging a clash of civilizations between the democracies that participate in these institutions and the dictatorships that don't. Which brings us to the second aim of the Biden regime, which is to contain China's influence. In 2012, Biden hosted Premier Xi Jinping in Washington and publicly celebrated the idea of the peaceful rise of China. He thought that America could soften the CCP's expansionist and authoritarian ambitions through trade and diplomacy. But in the intervening years, Biden has changed his mind. In February of this year, he appeared on CBS News, called Xi Jinping a thug, and promised to stand up to him. But Biden will not pursue Trump's strategy of economic confrontation because he recognizes that the trade war has hurt the US as much as it has hurt China. Perhaps his strongest response to the China threat will lie in his domestic policy platform. The Build Back Better program aims to divest the US from reliance on China by investing in a US production of things like 5G technology, artificial intelligence, and infrastructure. In addition to China, Biden also plans to get tough on Russia. For the first time since the beginning of the Cold War, the Democrats have become the party of Russia hawks in the United States. During his presidential campaign, Biden told reporters in Nevada, "Putin knows me, and he doesn't want me to be president." Biden has said that he will make Russia pay a price for its attacks on US democracy. And Jake Sullivan, Biden's longtime policy advisor, has hinted that this could mean targeting the perpetrators of those Russian attacks on US democracy with financial sanctions, asset freezes, and cyber attacks in response. But Biden has to be careful because he needs to make sure that Putin will renew deals such as the nuclear non-proliferation treaty that Trump dangerously abandoned. Biden has also promised to end America's forever wars in the Middle East. He plans to bring American troops home from the Middle East and focus his energies on East Asia. This is a very popular policy that most Americans favour and that many candidates have promised in the past, including Donald Trump. But it is unclear exactly what ending the forever wars means for Joe Biden. He plans to maintain a strong counterterrorism presence around the world, and if there is another human rights crisis like what Obama faced in Syria, it's unclear what his response will be. In addition, pulling out of the Middle East could alienate some of America's allies, for example, France and other European countries that sit on the doorstep of the Middle East and have come to rely on US intervention and leadership. So far in this presentation, I've talked about international threats and challenges to Biden's foreign policy. The final set of challenges that I want to talk about lie closer to home. The first thing to note here is that Biden's foreign policy team is ideologically divided within itself. So the journalist Thomas Wright has identified two camps in the team, the restorationists and the reformists. The restorationists are mostly former Obama advisors, such as, I don't have an example, who want a return to the Obama administration's status quo, which means a cautious, incremental approach that avoids conflict with China. The reformists, on the other hand, see themselves as responding to a global order that has changed substantially since Obama's presidency. They want to abandon Obama's lofty values and adopt a more opportunistic and adversarial approach in a chaotic international environment. Hearing these conflicting opinions should not necessarily represent a problem for the Biden foreign policy. It can be seen as a strength of his team that it will have serious internal debates within itself about the direction of US foreign policy. I think the bigger domestic threat to Biden's foreign policy comes from the Republican Party. Unless there is an upset in the runoff Senate elections in January, the Republicans are poised to keep control of the Senate, which will allow them to obstruct Biden's foreign policy by blocking nominees to posts in the Biden cabinet and in foreign policy agencies. So while Trump may have been defeated, Trumpism is alive and well within the Republican Party. Republicans have become more xenophobic and nationalist in the last decade and will likely be unwilling to cooperate with a multilateral approach that Biden wants to proceed with. Biden can be strategic and mobilize Republicans' suspicions about China and their desire to get US troops out of the Middle East to some advantage, but he will face difficulties in this domestic realm. The task before Biden is not an easy one. He has inherited a shaky global order and will face many domestic and international challenges as he tries to execute his global agenda. Whether he will conquer these challenges or be conquered by them remains to be seen.
Thank you, Marcus. Before we go on to our next address, can I remind you that you're very welcome to ask questions throughout the addresses. You don't have to wait till the end of the presentations. Just fire them in now using the Q&A function with your Zoom connection. Our fourth speaker, Wendy Hu, also recorded her address last week. Wendy is a fourth-year student at the University of Sydney studying for Bachelor of Commerce and Bachelor of Laws degrees. She has previously interned at the United States House of Representatives. Wendy is particularly interested in the international financial system, US politics and foreign policy, and the different conceptualizations of democratic institutions more broadly. Tonight, Wendy asks whether Malawi has set a new precedent for African politics. It is only the second African nation to have had a court overturn an election, and it's the first to deliver a win to an opposition. Over to Wendy.
On the 28th of June, Malawi became the second African nation to have a court-overturned vote after Kenya in 2017, and the first to deliver a win to the opposition. Lazarus Chakwera, head of the Malawi Congress Party, comfortably defeated incumbent President Peter Mutharika of the Democratic Progressive Party with 58% of votes. The June election was a rerun of the notorious TIPEX election annulled by the Malawi Constitutional Court in February 2020. This presentation will start with a brief introduction to Malawi. It will then examine the landmark Constitutional Court ruling in February, which overturned the first election result, followed by an analysis of the second election outcome. I will then end by discussing whether this great win for democracy will set a new precedent for politics in Africa, or if it was born from institutional factors unique to Malawi. So first, putting Malawi into context. Malawi is a landlocked country in southeastern Africa, which marked 50 years of independence from British rule in 2014. Post becoming a republic, Malawi was a one-party state for 30 years. Autocrat Hastings Banda finally ceded to international pressure in 1993, and the nation has had a democratic, multi-party government ever since. Malawi primarily hosts an agricultural economy, reliant heavily on the cash crops of tobacco and tea, as well as foreign aid. It is one of the least developed and most densely populated countries in the world. So on to the Constitutional Court ruling. In May 2019, Malawi held its general election in adherence with its 5-year election cycle, where incumbent President Mutharika was declared winner by just a 3% margin. And this outcome was not well received. Almost immediately, there were outcries of vote tampering, and thousands of protesters filled the streets calling for a new election. And they also demanded that Jane Ansah, who was the head of the Malawi Electoral Commission, step down. So a legal challenge to the May election outcome eventually found itself before the Malawi Constitutional Court. And in a landmark unanimous ruling in February 2020, the 5-judge bench called for a fresh election, citing widespread, systematic, and grave irregularities. And these included the unauthorized usage of correction fluid, hence the TIPEX election, duplicate result sheets, and unsigned forms. The court also overturned the first-past-the-post voting system. So in deciding the proper construction of majority in Section 80, subsection 2 of the Constitution, the president was now to be decided on who received 50% plus 1 of the total votes. So the second election. The second election was ordered for within 150 days, and the 9 opposition parties quickly consolidated to form the TONS Alliance. We had runner-up Lazarus Chakwera take the head position, and the incumbent vice president, Salus Chilima of the United Transformation Party, who placed third in the May election, assumed the deputy role. And this stood in stark contrast to the very fragmented first election. And the coalition was ultimately rewarded with a resounding win, receiving 2.6 million of the 4.4 million votes. So what contributed to their victory? First and most significantly, distrust of the incumbent Mutharika administration. Election fraud was only the tipping point of allegations of rampant corruption that has marred Mutharika's government. So, for example, in July 2013, Mutharika was accused by the Anti-Corruption Bureau to have taken bribes of $200,000 for a food supply contract. And unfortunately, Malawi is no stranger to government corruption. The looting of national coffers was systematic under the former president, Joyce Banda. And there was this infamous $32 million Cashgate scandal, which kind of rocked the country for many years. Second, Chakwera's profile cannot be underestimated. He is a theologian and was president of the Malawi Assemblies of God, which is the world's largest Pentecostal denomination, and he held this position for more than 2 decades. Now, over 80% of Malawis identify as Christian, and hence Chakwera, being a minister, imports a level of trust in government that has been sorely absent. And according to a poll by Afrobarometer, it found that 81% of Malawians trust religious leaders compared to the world average of 69%. And even his name, Lazarus, fittingly describes the rebirth that voters hope for the country. And third, Chakwera's strong campaign and policy platform. The Taunts Alliance and a strong social media campaign full of youthful energy stood in stark contrast with the elderly incumbent Mutharika, who remained in the capital and used traditional strategies. Chakwera also ran on a policy platform that promised to increase the minimum wage, create 1 million jobs, and subsidise the cost of fertiliser. And this resonated strongly with Malawians, 18 million of which are subsistence farmers. So as mentioned previously, Kenya is the only other African nation to have had an election result annulled by the judiciary. And even then, the incumbent President Kenyatta was re-elected. Malawi is the first African nation to have an opposition leader assume the presidency after an initial election was made invalid. So it is therefore no surprise that democracy activists are greatly excited about the precedential value of what has just transpired. Now, the African continent has been plagued by dictators, some notorious examples being Robert Mugabe and Omar al-Bashir. In the past 5 years, however, 26 African nations have transferred power, and this Malawi example seems to be that next progression to a fuller and richer democracy in the continent. But a closer look at Malawi's institutions reveals that the outcome should have not been that surprising or unexpected. So there were 3 institutions that were critical to Chakwera's success. First, the Malawian Courts, which have a long history of judicial independence and respect for the constitution. For example, in 2009, they overruled an attempt to extend term limits. Second, its military. The Malawi Defence Forces did not defend the incumbent administration, but instead shielded the citizens and the judges. And third, Malawi has a vibrant civil society. The protests were not just large, but frequent, and supported by domestic groups such as the Human Rights Defenders Coalition. Malawi's general election outcome is undoubtedly significant, not just for African politics, but for other nations dealing with a legacy of autocracy and which are transitioning towards a more rigorous democratic system. Whether it will have the precedential value democracy advocates believe it does, however, only time will tell.
Our next presentation is by Emilia Pravlov. Emilia recently completed Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Laws degrees at Macquarie University, majoring in international law and global governance. She'll be beginning her master's degree in national security policy at the Australian National University in February. She's particularly interested in security policies and changing methods of warfare. Emilia hopes to work in this field following her postgraduate degree. She will look at why Australia has not yet securitized its response to climate change, focusing on what it might mean for our role in the South Pacific if we did. Emilia.
Tonight, I will be discussing Australia's failure to view climate change as a threat to national security. I will look at how the Australian government's current policy approach in this area and how it may undermine our national interests, both at home and abroad. So, what would be the benefits to securitising the climate crisis in Australia? Firstly, on the simple fact that climate change is now considered to be the #1 issue facing the world. Based on the science, climate change is occurring at a faster rate and with increased detrimental consequences for nations than other more traditional threats. We saw this recently in the bushfires of last summer, the longer lasting droughts, and the increased freak storms. By securitising an issue, a state must accept the serious consequences it would bring. It takes away the debate and allows for direct action. In the case of Australia, this would look like a broad acknowledgement of the anticipated risks of climate change as a threat multiplier. It would encourage a coordinated response from the government and sectors of the public service, particularly the Department of Defence and Department of Foreign Affairs. This would be vastly different to the current state of play, where states are forced to introduce their own legislative measures as the federal government remains gridlocked by party lines, and members can make broad-reaching statements without enforceability. We have seen this when in 2004, then Prime Minister John Howard referred to climate action as being one of the major challenges confronting the world this century, and in 2008, when then Prime Minister Rudd described it to be a most fundamental national security challenge for the long-term future. But we haven't yet seen the action needed to address these risks, so it is only reasonable that we move away from politics to real action. This shift will also reflect the concerns of the general public, with a poll conducted by the Lowy Institute finding 2/3 of the Australian population view climate change to be a major threat facing the nation. Another benefit of securitising an issue would be that emergency measures can be propelled through. This would mean that climate action would bypass the usual rules, procedures and accountability measures associated with bureaucracy and policy debates. If Australia was to shift climate change from being a discussion to a national security threat, we would be able to limit unneeded discussion over if it's happening to a forward-thinking response to protect our national security. At this point, it is also useful to look at other nations and their responses. The recent election of Joe Biden will bring in a new era for American politics, as he has advised climate change is to be cast as a national security threat and will be included in the security apparatus of the new government. However, this is not a completely new idea from America, with examples of such thinking coming from the United States Department of Defense, who have issued multiple reports outlining this threat. These outlined an abrupt climate change scenario could destabilise the geopolitical environment and lead to further conflicts over resources. We have also seen similar stands taken in the EU, with their collective securitisation of climate change, and in the United Kingdom, who have taken a whole-of-government approach to framing climate action as being in the best interests of national security. This leads to the question of why it is not yet domestically considered a security threat, despite the unimaginable consequences should prompt action not be taken. We must ask ourselves why the recent Australian Defence Force strategic update failed to consider it, while other global militaries are labelling it a threat multiplier. Despite this recent update failing to recognise it, the White Paper in 2016 did identify the risk that climate change would drive national disasters and political instability in the Pacific. So what would it look like if climate change was securitised in Australia? Frankly, we do not quite know. But if we were to follow the models of the EU and the UK, we would see climate action being given increased importance in the various domains of public policy, such as military funding, international obligations, and economic planning. However, there are risks associated with securitising an issue. Some claim that it provides the government with the ability to manipulate the crisis and blur the divide between economic, social, cultural, and military affairs. Others say that we must persevere with the domain of democratic policymaking and put pressure on those elected to pass legislation which ensures action, rather than putting it beyond the scope of politics. Clearly, there are benefits to be gained from securitising climate change, as well as likely negative consequences, and it may be difficult to ascertain what holds the most leverage. However, one thing is certain in these uncertain times: climate action is needed at a faster rate than what it is currently developing. We must also consider it from the perspective of our regional neighbours, who are facing increased freak weather events, changing environments, and in many cases are losing the very land they live on. The islands of the South Pacific, while discussed in the Defence Force paper as being vital to Australia's regional role, may not exist if we do not take climate action seriously. These states are calling for Australia to step up in its response to climate action to reflect the 2018 Boe Declaration. This declaration, which Australia was a party to, identified climate change to be the region's single greatest security threat. Yet we still fail to recognise it in our policies, with our Pacific Step Up focusing on development efforts, but failing to listen to the pleas of the South Pacific to act on climate change. It can be seen that Australia's failure to respond to climate change adequately will continue to strain important relationships with our neighbours who otherwise would benefit from proactive decisions to mitigate and adapt to climate action. With the aim being stabilisation and security, we must consider how this can be achieved in the current political environment. And if this cannot be done, as I've discussed above, then whether we should consider the biggest risk to humanity to be a threat to our national security. I believe that by considering climate change as a threat to security, we may break the cycle of inaction and allow for strong action to be taken before it is too late. Thank you.
Many thanks, Emilia. We're still standing by for your questions, but meanwhile, our final presentation is from Thomas Shortbridge. Thomas is undertaking his Bachelor of Arts Honours year in Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. He currently oversees the New South Wales Debating Union and has become a semi-finalist in the World Championships and a top 10 speaker at the Australian Championships. His research interests focus on comparative politics, African politics, authoritarian regimes, and democratic transitions. His address tonight suggests rethinking regional relationships and structures. He looks at the economic community of West African states as an alternative to such familiar models as the European Union. Thomas.
Well, when people normally think about regionalism and regional bodies, they turn to the European Union, which follows what has become a standard trajectory. It began as an economic community, ensuring that coal and steel trading would be done more easily, and has since then blossomed into becoming a full regional body. And that's the kind of trajectory that has been echoed around the world, that most regional bodies pursue the same trajectory. They begin focusing on economic beliefs, and then they go into other things if they are lucky enough to develop institutions like the EU Parliament. But something very different has happened in West Africa, that ECOWAS, the economic community of West African states, has begun without any of this economic development, but has developed other institutions that seem to elude other far more economically integrated bodies. And that's kind of what I'm focusing on in this presentation today. I'm first looking at what exactly separates ECOWAS from other bodies and what makes it peculiar. And secondly, we'll look into what exactly explains that particular peculiarity. So what is it that makes ECOWAS different to other regional bodies? Well, the most notable thing is that it lacks the economic integration of other, more developed economic bodies, that it has suffered and has been unable to put into place common economic tariffs or more comprehensive free trade agreements. And as a result, very little trade in the region flows between nations that exist in the region themselves. They mostly sell and buy from other countries that are not in their body. In fact, only 10% of nations' total trade flows are from intra-ECOWAS trade. But even more peculiarly for its economic standing, very little even of that 10% actually is attributable to ECOWAS itself, because there's this peculiar quirk about many sub-Saharan African regional bodies, where they are made up of a series of other bodies and sub-bodies under them. So in ECOWAS, the 15 nations that comprise it are further divided into WEMU, the West African Economic and Monetary Union, which is largely the Francophone nations of West Africa, and WAMS, the West African Monetary Zone, which is the Anglophone nations of West Africa. And those nations themselves have some of their own agreements that, for example, the WEMU has the CFA franc as a common currency and a series of free trade agreements, which means that the amount of trade that ECOWAS itself generates by its unique policies and its unique agreements is only about 1.5% of its total nation's trade flows. So most of them choose to trade within these either overseas or within these sub-regional bodies. And while it's not very peculiar for a nation to have limited economic development, many nations in the Pacific Islands or in other regions in Africa struggle to reach the economic development of the European Union or of ASEAN. But unlike those groups, ECOWAS has a series of bodies itself, that it has the ECOWAS Court of Community Justice, which is a binding regional court, which is itself particularly surprising, and it finds on the grounds of human rights abuses that regularly verdicts against bodies like Nigeria on its failure to educate its people or on its failure to adequately prevent dumping in the Niger Delta have been upheld and abided to by those countries. Or cases against human rights abuses against journalists have been held against countries like Ghana or Senegal. And those are places that we have then able to be held to account by the ECCJ. Or similarly, they have a large amount of regional peacekeeping together. They have, since 1990, collected their forces to go into 8 separate missions as a regional body and violate the sovereignty of other regional members. And that is very unusual for nations to be willing to cede their sovereignty and contribute troops to these regional groups. So why has ECOWAS been able to develop like this? Why does it have very little economic development and integration, which normally binds nations together, but despite that has been able to find ways to bind that eludes almost every other regional organization? It is because there is this peculiarity of West Africa, which is an exceptionally dominant Nigeria. That Nigeria's population is more than the other 14 nations combined, and in itself accounts for about 2/3 of the total trade and total economic production of the region. And the trajectory that ECOWAS has gone down as a body is reflective of the interest of Nigeria itself. That Nigeria does not want a large amount of economic integration in the region. It will gain very little from that because almost all of its economy is by exporting oil to richer countries who exist overseas and has no interest in making it easier to export that oil to local nations. And similarly, it is not able to benefit as from the similar kinds of policies that other nations might because it is already able to produce goods very cheaply, it has a large workforce and a very low minimum wage. So it stands to gain very little from economic development. But it does also stand to lose a lot that by binding it together with other nations through proposals like a common currency extended beyond WEMU would make it linked to the economies of the region that surrounds it, and as the clear dominant power would likely be required to operate and put out bailouts in times of economic crisis and be more concerned with the economic fates of the regions and nations around it, which is why time and time again, the Nigeria as a dominant country has stymied and has stalled the ability for those nations to economically integrate. But it has been in the interest of Nigeria to have military intervention, either because it wanted to protect allied groups or allied leaders, as it did in the First Liberian Civil War, or an ability to stand out as a human rights protector in order to avoid things like sanctions that were also potentially proposed against Nigeria in the 1990s. So it pushed for the formation of things like ECOMOG, which was the group that went into Liberia, and it's pushed for a continuation of those military bodies. And maybe the question then arises, well, it doesn't really seem in the interest of Nigeria to create things like the ECOWAS Community Court. In fact, Nigeria has been the most common party that has been sued in that court. But if you think about it this way, Nigeria requires a dedication to human rights to be part and parcel of the ECOWAS image. That in order to justify human rights interventions as military interventions, you require those to be seen as human rights causes, which needs, when there were various things totaled against them and there were complaints made, they needed to be able to prove that there was a commitment to human rights in the region, and thus also spearheaded the ECOWAS Community Court. So where does this leave us when we think about regionalism more broadly? It leads us to challenge and rethink the traditional and until now really solo way in which people think about regionalism, to think about it as a necessary trajectory that begins with economic integration and goes from there. But secondly, it asks us to think and look at the regional specifics of what is going on in these countries. Maybe not every region has a dominant power like Nigeria, but each region has specific contextual factors that will moderate and change the expectations of regionalism. And this talk, and I hope I ask you now to think more about other ways regional bodies can develop and to think about differences in regional contexts that could change their outcomes. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Thomas. And now it's over to you, the audience, to fire your questions at us.
Thank you very much, Ian. Yes, I would like to invite everyone to please submit your questions, and if you do not wish to ask a question with your video and audio on, like as it already has happened, you can submit an anonymous question. So we do have one anonymous question, and this one is for Emilia. And it's, do you agree that the imperative of policies to address climate change must not continue to ignore the possible contribution of peaceful nuclear energy? Over to you.
Thank you for your question. In regards to the use of nuclear as a different means of approaching climate change, I think that's definitely a debate that needs to be had. But to have that debate in the first place, we still have to recognise that something has to change. And so without getting to the point in government and in policy making where we admit there's currently an issue with the state of play of our energy systems in Australia, we can't actually engage with that. So I'd say possibly, but not yet. So thank you.
We have a question now for Namaya, and the question is, how do you think America's relations with India will or won't change with the new Biden administration, and what would be the impact on the Quad?
Thank you for your question. I do think that President-elect Biden will pursue the Quad as is, because America needs to stay relevant. And there has been a lot of commentary from the Indian side that the Quad itself could be irrelevant to India in that that being part of the Quad on India's end will be more, there'll be little to gain, and it would be more of an aggressor to China and then have retaliation. And I think that America needs to make sure that India is included in their conversations going forward, and that they're not forced into a corner by their policies with China, because India is more vulnerable given that they actually share a territorial boundary with China. So yeah, I think America needs to be careful going forward, because they can't continue to force the countries who have actual territorial disputes, because America itself is quickly losing power, and so specifically in regions where they don't have actual reach as their military capabilities sort of falter. So I think it's really important that they actually give India the chance to actually speak up for themselves and set more of the agenda for the Quad. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we have a question for Evangeline, and this one is, do you think that the fairly newly elected president of the SADR, Brahim Ghali, may have incited some of the recent violence?
Thank you for your question. And yes, I think you definitely have to take into account a lot of different factors when trying to understand why a conflict that has been fairly quiet for 30 years suddenly reignites just a couple of weeks ago. And I don't think we're going to fully understand that for the next couple of months as we see things play out. Obviously, leadership on both sides plays an integral role. We saw that with the Polisario really capitalizing on the actions of Sahrawi people, and I think definitely President Ghali had a role to play in that, as he was the one who obviously declared war. However, I think that whether his recent election and his newness to the role is a factor, I don't know if that is as relevant. Instead, rather capitalizing on a situation and a particular area of the disputed territory that is of importance both to the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic and Morocco. So I think it was more of an opportunistic moment, and obviously as a new leader wanting to make a mark. So I think we'll have to see how the continued clashes play out to truly understand the leadership role in what occurred. Thank you.
Thanks, Evangeline. And the final question we've got tonight is for Tom. Do you think that it's worthwhile making comparisons between regional blocks and regional economic areas and things like that? Or do you think it's more worthwhile studying them in depth in their own sort of characteristics?
Thanks for your question. I think that's a really interesting thing to consider. I think that there's definite value in both of those ways of approaching studies of regionalism. And I think that in order to make comparisons to other bodies, you first do need an in-depth understanding of that body as an institution itself. But I don't think that that study of a region on its own can bear as much fruit as a study of that region on its own and in comparison to other bodies. But in doing that comparison, I do think it's really important to keep in mind the differences that exist between them. So if you are making ideas that come out of comparison of West Africa and Europe, it's important to remember that West Africa as a whole is, for example, far less democratic, far less economically stable, far less stable in terms of military interventions as compared to Europe. And those are the kind of things that should come into consideration when you're thinking about those. But I just think overall it's important to do both of those kinds of things, and through that you get the best understanding, and as part of that process you slowly develop and learn ways in which you can refine general theories in application to specific regions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That concludes the questions for the evening. I'd like to return to Ian Lincoln to conclude the evening.
Thank you. Many thanks to all of the people who've asked questions tonight, which has added a great deal, I think, to the liveliness of our event. And I hope that you'll join us next week. We have a very interesting address coming up on Wednesday, the 9th of December, by Professor James Curran of the University of Sydney. He's entitled his address, "What's New is Old Again," and he's going to address the problems of the past and the future with Australia-China relations. But for now, I'd like to express very warm thanks to all 6 of our interns, those here with us tonight and the disembodied ones who are somewhere else. It's been very interesting to hear your presentations, and I think they generated real interest amongst our audience. I'd also like to put in a very strong word of thanks to the technical team, who you can't see, but I can see them, and they've done a terrific job tonight. It's been a great thing to get this kind of event underway. So, warmest thanks to everyone. Look forward to next week.